Douglas, are you with us?
Certainly am. I am at my end.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining our conference. We're all delighted and that you could join this conference organized by Oikos and New Direction. I know your time is very valuable, so we just get straight to it, I guess. My first question is that you have very successfully written several political books. You have taken part in countless debates, and you have traveled all over the world to give speeches and lectures. And you've been very celebrated for this, but you have also been a subject for scorn and criticism, and in many cases also hate. So I guess my first question would be, why? What is it that drives you? What is your main motivation? What makes all the effort worthwhile for you?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you. And I really wish I could be back with my friends in Sweden in person. I'm going to ask one technical point, which is that I occasionally hear Swedish in my ear from one of the technical people. If they're translating, it's not for me. Anyhow, I don't actually, I don't feel beleaguered in any way. I've spent my life as a writer, as a journalist and an author. I get to travel around the world and write about what I find interesting. And I tend to be attracted to difficult issues, which is something I can do nothing about. And you're right that some people don't like that, but it's never really bothered me. And I would urge other people to take the same attitude. I don't like there's a current thing that particularly occurs in Britain where MPs and others complain about how much people dislike them and nasty things people say about them. I don't really have much time for this. The social media world has made people even more self-absorbed than they were before, and they're even self-absorbed about the abuse that comes towards them. And none of this matters. All that matters is you get on with your work, you do what you should do, and you tell the truth as you see it, and that just live with the consequences. So that's always been my attitude. I've never been bothered by criticism, wherever it comes from, unless it comes from people who I respect. But there's a very small number of such people. So.
Well, you've been incredibly successful at doing so. So what I would like to know, you're calling in right now from the States, if I'm not mistaken, right? I know that you're currently living in the state of Florida. And what I would like to know is, what are the pros and cons of being a public figure now also in the States compared to here in Europe?
That's a very interesting question. Well, one thing is, of course, is that journalists are thought of differently in America than they are in Britain, and certainly, I think, in Europe. And obviously, journalism is part of what I do. American journalists see themselves as very serious figures. The weight of the republic sits on their figures. British journalists, at any rate, regard it is a very important job, but also fun, and we don't take ourselves too seriously, and we don't carry ourselves as if the entire world is reading every word we write. American journalists do tend to behave like that, and as a result, there's a much greater focus on every fallout. So the thing that I notice most is that, particularly on the American right, there is just so much falling out. Everybody has fallen out with everybody in the last few years, partly because of the Trump effect, partly because of 2016, part of what happened in January this year. But so everyone has fallen out, and I noticed that the right in Europe is not exactly homogenous, or it is itself prone to fallouts, but nothing like the American right of late. So that's one of the main things I noticed, is that even people who are almost completely in alliance on things, politicians and indeed writers and others, have all fallen out with each other. and are all believing that they are the only one that can possibly lead the republic in the right direction. I think this is a big mistake and another example of self-absorption. But there's a lot going on in the States at the moment. That's why I'm here. I mean, it's a fascinating time in the life of this country, because you can see that it is at a crucial turning point, a sort of turn where some people are trying to make it step away from its own roots, and others want to, broadly speaking, keep the roots that they have. And I mean, this is playing out in the New York Times and in other major media. It's the New York Times that commissioned the 1619 Project to reframe and indeed rewrite the founding date of America. So the founding of America is there's the date when the first slaves came into the continent. That completely rewrites the history of America. And journalists in this country are completely involved in that. And these are big mega shifts to be going on in the society.
My next question is regarding your book, Manners of Crowd, that came out, I think, 2019, and was translated into Swedish by Carnival Förlag last year, I think. In Swedish, it's called Kollektiv Galenskap. And in this book, in the beginning, you point to several factors, materialistic as well as non-materialistic, as possible explanations to the emergence of the paradigm that we are still in many ways, of woke culture and identity policy. And I was curious, which one of these explanations that you mention in your book do you consider to be the most important one? And also, I would like to know, to what extent do you think that this development of this paradigm has been organic, and to what extent is it manufactured politically?
Well, what I describe in the Manners of Crowds is the sort of almost organic nature of some of it. The way in which rights movements from the 1960s in particular morphed into a sort of civic religion, really, where it was not acceptable by the late 20th century to identify yourself by national belonging, but it became positively admirable to identify yourself by sexual belonging or sexual identity belonging or racial belonging. Now, I tried to lay out in the Manners of Crowds just what this looked like, how it happened, and indeed warn people away from it. Since the Manners of Crowds came out, we do know a bit more about one of the drivers, which is worth mentioning, which is the way in which corporations, woke capital has been called, has become a driver for this. My friend Vivek Ramaswamy has written a very fine book that just came out on this. This is an important addition, an addendum to the Manners of Crowds, which is the way in which corporations saw woke ideology as being a good way to sort of launder their own reputations, so that in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, for instance, when people were not very fond of banks, there were a number of things that banks could have done, some did do, but the easiest thing was to do very little and plaster your shop front, as it were, in all of the correct signage. Fly the rainbow flag everywhere. A Coutts Bank in London, which is the Queen's Bank, a very grand bank, currently has its London headquarters on the Strand, plastered with a huge photograph of a black footballer called Marcus Rashford, who's a very fine footballer and a good guy. I mean, he's done a lot of work for charity and to help disadvantaged children. But why would Coutts Bank cover themselves with this man's image? Only because, again, it's a cheaper way to say to the world, we're with the beat, we're with the culture, we're not doing anything that you're not asking us to do. So it's become a sort of sign frontage. And I think that this has actually, and you can see it from the donations of corporations to very bad groups like BLM, you see it in that. But I think this combination of factors of this extreme new ideology with already existing vested interests wishing to keep themselves in the game is definitely an explanation for why this has gone so bad.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier woke capitalism, and that's a debate that is growing in Sweden, and a phenomenon that's growing in Sweden as well. And there's two sides to that. It's one part is that you have companies donating a lot of money to quite extreme and radical groups like the BLM, but it's also the factor that they are making away with meritocracy in the sense that you have this identity politics when you hire people, even for higher positions, and that would probably make us less efficient compared to our international competitors. So what could be done about this? Can conservatives still stick to the guns about not involving politics in the free market, or should we also build like consumer power organizations to try to strike back against this, or what's the solution? Is there anything to be done about it?
It's one of the most worrying things that, as you raise, because everybody is seeing it in their own lives, in their own businesses. I was speaking with a friend just yesterday here about the rather rarefied example, but I think it's the University of Chicago's English department that has said that only black and ethnic minority people should apply for postgraduate studies. Jobs being advertised, this is again more prominent in the States maybe than elsewhere for the time being, but jobs being advertised saying that priority and preference would be given for ethnic minority applicants, or sometimes actually saying, basically white people shouldn't apply. This is so lethal. I mean, I don't need to tell you this. This is lethal stuff. Wow. I'm 42 now, and but if I was starting off, and this is a hard time to start off for any young person. It never is easy, but people have had their educations disrupted. They've had their lives disrupted. They're already entering this very complex scenario where it's very hard for young people to accumulate capital, as it is for everyone, but it's very hard to accumulate capital and get on the housing ladder, for instance. And you're thinking of all these things. You're trying to start a career. You've done your work and you've followed the rules. And then you come across this, where by dint of something you've no say in, you're judged to be unworthy of even applying for a certain job. This is lethal stuff, and I wish the people who are playing with this would stop right now, because I can only think of the anger, the disappointment, the frustration that I would feel if I was somebody who encountered that at any stage of life. It has to be said. Let's say you're a guy or woman in your 40s or 50s who's worked hard, played by the rules, risen up a company, and then you see that, again, by dint of a character trait over which you have no say, your skin color, you're not going to get that little bit further or that lot further. This is how you can really poison a person by this treatment. You can make incredibly bitter souls, and I'd like to think it'll stop, or at least it could reverse. I suspect the way it'll happen will be through the courts. Will be people taking actions through the courts which strike down these as being fundamentally against, in the case of America, against civil rights legislation. That it actually does exactly the opposite of what's intended and makes racial characteristics the determining trait. In other countries, I don't know. I mean, in Sweden, for instance, there will be test cases like everywhere else. But I would urge people to do that. But we can't allow it just to run, because what the people who are doing this think is going to happen is that we're going to get to what they call equality, by which they mean equity, and that at the point of equity, we will all be happy. Now, there's no guarantee that any such state exists or ever could exist, let alone that it can be created by these kinds of policies. So we're carrying out this very, very dangerous societal experiment in pursuit of an end that almost certainly is unachievable. I don't believe that you can, as you say, be competitive on the world stage if you decide that you should prioritize anything other than excellence at every level in your society. You know, I mean, if you if you do this in any strata of society, and we always talk about the quite rarefied levels, you know, the MA programs at distinguished universities or the boards of major companies. But if you look at any area of life, take an electrician, if you decided that your electricians should be prioritized based on their racial background, you're going to have an awful lot of electric shocks in the years to come, because you are not prioritizing excellence, and that's the same in area after area.
I completely understand if you can't really talk in depth about this, but if I understand it correctly, you are currently writing a book or finishing a new book, and the title will be
Yes.
War on the West. Is there anything, can you give us a small sneak peek about what that, the topic and why you're writing it, and yeah, tell us something about your new project. We're all very excited.
It's coming out in April. Obviously, if I told you anything much about it, I'd have to kill you. That's very difficult. I wouldn't want to. No, it's been just a huge pleasure to write, because it's a subject I've been gearing up for all my life. It's on what I think is the big thing of our era, which is anti-Westernism. Hatred of everything if it's ours, admiration of everything so long as it's not ours. That attitude which regards what we have not just as like everything else, but much worse than everything else. So the War on the West, which yes comes out in April, is my big.
Oh, sorry, we lost you for a while there. But
You lost me. I was in the midst of saying that it's the beginning of what I hope is a fight back.
we hope so too.
I'm very, very keen to arm people with the defences of our own society and our own culture and our own history, and to not allow what has gone on through all of my lifetime. I think I can probably say all of our lifetimes, which is a just savage misrepresentation of our own past and an unbelievably blithe veneration of everyone else's. And so it's a defense of the West, an argument for the West, and a very big run at the people I think of as being the enemy.
So as conservatives, we're very good usually at saying what we don't like. We're very good at saying that we don't like wokeness, that we need to stop mass migration, that we don't like what postmodern feminism has done to our societies. What can we do in order to get young people, especially on our side, to tell them what conservatism stands for? What would you say if you would have to give us 3 things that makes the West the best, so to say? What would you tell them?
I can't give 3 things. I either have to give 1 or it'll be endless.
What will do?
I think it's very important to talk about what we have. I think this is one of the single most important things in our era, is that you're quite right that there is a lot of conservatives are prone to self-pity, to belly aching, as some people say, to complaint, and to much more. And we should do some of that. We should certainly do some of the complaining, some of the lambasting, some of the criticizing. I certainly do, and it's not just a duty but a pleasure. However, it is only the beginning of what you need to do. I'm very conscious of this in my own life. It's actually one of the things that the War on the West is very focused on, is saying we must turn this around from being simply criticizing what we don't like to explaining and defending what we do, and doing so better. Now, as I say, I could go on endlessly about this, but let me give you an example. I think it's the case. I've been to Sweden, as you both know, quite a number of times. Sadly, haven't been able to for a couple of years, obviously. But it's my impression that many young Swedish people, like many young British people, and particularly many young Americans, think that what they enjoy in our societies is sort of the norm. That, you know, parachute in pretty much anywhere in the world and demand your rights and you'll get them, you know. And this is a wild misunderstanding of the world. And people, it seems to me, have grown up not realizing that what we have in countries like Sweden or Britain is highly unusual, not just in historical terms, which is certainly unusual in, but in current day terms. Now, you know, I used to, when I was touring after The Strange Death of Europe came out, and I went back to almost every country in Europe that I'd also been at when I was researching that book, I had a line I used to use about luck. You might have heard me say it. So there's a problem we have with the migration question, for instance, where Western people now are confused about what to do with their luck. They sort of look at the rest of the world and they intuit maybe it isn't that great. They might pretend that it is. But what do we do about people who want to come and share that luck? Now, the reason I tell you this is because I was speaking when I was in Norway once to a group of politicians, and I used this line. And one of them said something that completely changed my thinking on this. She said, "No, Douglas, it's not just luck, what we have. It's because we made good choices. We in Norway have the same energy reserves as they do in Venezuela. But there's a reason that we're Norway and they're Venezuela, which is that we made better choices." Now, I put it to you, this is a very, very important thing to consider. There was an American baseball player called Branch Rickey who had said once something I'm very fond of. He said, "Luck is the residue of design." So it's not just luck that we have happened to be here with political order, peace, rights, and then everything to do with the culture. That's not just luck. That's the design of generations who've gone before. And I think conservatives should be clear to young people, particularly, saying the left is offering you the opportunity to live a life of disappointment because it's urging you to live a life in which you constantly struggle, quite often against things you can do nothing about. And we shouldn't seem to be complacent or simply content, but we should say it's also necessary to find your peace and your place in the world. And the best way to do that is to find your place in the culture which you're in, and to not just sustain that culture, but to take it forward, to continue it, to grow upon it. It's Gustav Mahler who said once that the culture is not the raking over of ashes, but the preservation of fire. I mean, I'm very sad when people present the arguments that the right makes as if we only complain, because there is something to it. But we all have to be aware of it, and we have to up our game on it. We have to realize very often that we're speaking to people who don't realize what we are offering them in terms of a fulfilling life, a more peaceable life, a happier life, a more contented life, and much more, and an understanding and appreciation of the place that they've come from. You know, obviously Sweden is different from Britain, is different from America. We're all defending. I remember once I was there in Sweden with you, and our late friend Roger Scruton was speaking, and he said, of course, the problem for conservatives is to a great extent that we're all conserving different things, whereas the left always has one thing everywhere that it's always saying. But that isn't only a weakness; it's also a strength. You say we're conserving something in Sweden that's extremely important, just like we're defending something in Britain that's very important. The Americans are defending something that's very important to them. It doesn't need to be the same thing. But to live in that and to accept your inheritance and to engage in it and to take it forward, now there is a very good thing to do with your life. There is a life with purpose.
I'm very glad that you brought up Roger Scruton, because that was actually my next question. And it also becomes very natural when we talk about love of home, oikophilia, and respect for one's heritage, because very few other people did a greater effort than Sir Roger Scruton in this regard. And the first time I met you, Douglas, was, as you mentioned, in Sweden. I think it was 2016. And so Roger Scruton came to give a speech for my party, the Sweden Democrats, at that time. And for me personally, he's been a great inspiration. And later tonight, we're going to have a Roger Scruton memorial dinner here at the conference. And I know that you were closer to him than most. And for the young people who might have not discovered him yet or might not know about him yet, could you give us a picture of how you perceived Sir Roger Scruton as a person, as a human being, but also what you consider to be his most important political, philosophical legacy?
Well, he was a wonderful man, as you know, rather shy, sometimes at odds with the world, awkward with the world. But he was an exceptionally warm and generous person in my experience, and an enormously encouraging person. I think there are doubtless people in the hall as well as you and I who can attest to that. He took enormous pains to encourage people, to help them, often in very practical ways that grand figures don't often bother themselves with. He was filled always with practical help and advice, and he was one of the most remarkable people I've known ever. I was very fond of him, much admired him. He had a huge effect on my life. His legacy is his thought. His thought is best perhaps contained in the dozens of books that he wrote and published during his lifetime. I think that Roger's achievements were so extraordinary that it's impossible to sum up in one thing, because of course he wrote so expertly on so many things and thought so expertly on them, on the nature of art and architecture, on the nature of religion, on sex, on home, on philosophy, on literature, on opera, so many things. But I always encourage people to read, who haven't encountered his work, to read a book that's now, it turns out, partly because I keep recommending it, to be very hard to get hold of, which is his book on hunting. And On Hunting is really a memoir about not just how he fell in love with hunting, but how he fell in love with his wife Sophie and how he met her, and how he found himself able to find peace with the world around him. And you don't have to, you don't have to be at all interested in hunting yourself. I'm not myself. It's just a wonderful book. It's a wonderful short memoir that explains really how he found himself in later life. It's a very revealing book and a very moving book. But I think his legacy is already with us. It's been so moving. I'm so pleased and touched that you're honouring him this evening. I've been so moved by the number of people who have a desire to remember and to keep Roger's memory alive. And it's particularly encouraging. I'm on the advisory board of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, and one of the reasons I'm involved is because quite often after a great person like Roger dies, there's a sort of reputational slump for some years after they die, because if they're celebrated, I mean, Roger wasn't celebrated enough in his lifetime, but he was celebrated. Quite often when somebody is celebrated in their lifetime, after their death, there's a sort of hiatus in their reputation. And then it takes a while for people to rediscover them. I was absolutely certain and wanted to make sure that there was never a hiatus in Roger's reputation. And I don't think there will be. I'm really struck that in the almost 2 years now since his death, his thought is just continuing to spread outwards. So many people tell me that I'm discovering his work, discovering his thought, and I think that if there's one thing in particular, I would say that's caused by it's that it's to use a title of one of his books, he invited people into this great tradition. And people can feel it. He reached out a hand in his lifetime when he was alive in person, but he reaches out a hand still to not to admonish, but to encourage and to draw people in to this great tradition, which he believed, quite rightly, understandably, needed defending, needed furthering, and needed to be preserved. And I'm very struck by the fact that I think that his reputation is only going to grow, and that's a sign of a really great person.
Do we have time for one more question?
I think we have time for one short question.
One short question, then I'll go back to one of your other books, Mr. Murray, The Strange Stuff of Europe. So the title might sound a little definite, Death of Europe. But when I listen to you right now, I hear a man who sounds like he's hopeful.
That's because I'm in America.
In Florida, moreover. So should we be hopeful? Is it inevitable that Europe will die, or do you think that there is such a thing possible as maybe a European revival?
Well, I do say, it's a very important question. I'm very glad you asked it. I do say in The Strange Death of Europe that everything I describe can be turned around. You know, none of it is inevitable. None of this is inevitable. It goes back to that point I made about luck. It's all about what decisions you make. There was a critique of that book from some people who said you're part of the problem if you present it like this. You're prophesying something which, if you believe it, is inevitable. There's nothing you can do. Of course, as I say, I mean, I really do go to some pains, particularly towards the end of that book, to explain how you could change this around. I don't know what's going to happen with our continent. I do know that we haven't yet addressed the questions that I raised in that book. I mean, obviously there are parties across the continent that do want to address the question. But governments still seem to find it so impossible. And it seems to me that our wider societies are very confused about it. Take a situation in my own country of birth, Great Britain. Britain, just earlier this week, had I think 1,400 people arrived in a single day by boat across the Channel, which was a new record from the hellhole that is France. And these fleeing migrants are simply assisted ashore by the British authorities. And the British government, I happen to know, thinks that this is just a problem that it can't really deal with, and maybe the public aren't noticing. That's one of their calculations. They think that it'll just continue, but it won't be a big scandal. It's a problem it's as it were a PR problem they can cope with. They ignore the fact that every day, let's say on a day like that, 1,400 people come in. These are not 1,400 people who, even if they were all doctors and eye surgeons, are going to go straight into work as doctors and eye surgeons. They are not. They are going to be a net drain on the state. Now, I understand what the benefit is to these people to want to come. I do not understand what the benefit is to Britain. And I'm afraid that it's quite clear to me now that these are the terms in which we have to think about this. You know, sadly, the world is a terrible place filled with unhappiness, unfairness, war, famine, and much more. It is not in our gift to save the world, or at least we can't do it without sinking ourselves. And I'm afraid that I see very little willingness to recognize that simple fact and to try to avoid something which is inevitable. Is not inevitable, sorry. I mean, you know, it's not inevitable that those boats have to cross the Channel every day. You could just stop them, turn them around. You could return everyone to the countries they came from. You could do what we're meant to do. But I don't see the political will to do that. And in that situation, what I describe in The Strange Death of Europe will just continue, and it'll in our own lifetimes, what I prophesied will come about, because our countries will simply not be the countries that they were if, in the years to come, we continue to believe that our societies are best when we're a sort of convening point for the world. My favorite statistic was a Gallup poll from a couple of years ago that said that 1/3 of people in sub-Saharan Africa want to move. Now, and they don't want to move to Saudi Arabia. They're not urging to break into Tajikistan. They want to come to Europe. Well, Europe can't have them. We simply can't have them, and we've got to work out a way to humanely and decently, but definitively, make sure that the world doesn't think it can come to Europe. And I think that that's doable, but our politicians seem to think otherwise. And so long as they allow that to continue, this trajectory I lay out in the book will occur. And I very much hope it doesn't, obviously. I very much hope it doesn't. And the policies I suggest and the attitudes I suggest towards the end of that book, I wish people would pick up. I do think, however, that its success and the ongoing success of people who have picked up arguments in it and who had themselves come to the same conclusions, the success of some people who've done that is a testament to the fact that we're onto something. So many people are worried about this, and so many people, I don't need to tell you, both of you, so many people just are worried about expressing their worries. Well, we go back to that thing we started off from. It's the job of anyone who has freedom in their lives to express the concerns and to ask the questions that other people feel they can't.
Thank you so much, Douglas. It's been a pleasure, as always. I hope you enjoy your stay in the States, but I also hope that you come back to Europe soon. We need you, and it would be lovely to have you back in Sweden soon again. And all the best with...
Well, I was going to say, absolutely. If you... can we make a deal that we meet in Sweden again next?
Yes. I'll send you my phone number and we'll sort something out. Thank you very much, and best of luck with your new book project. We're all looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Douglas Murray.
Thank you to everyone there. Thank you.